Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to witness the moment months of distance finally break when Jack runs through the airport to hold Tu Tien again, turns their first kiss at home into a flood of everything they've endured apart, and then sits beside her under the stars with one quiet promise. I'll always come back. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The airport was already alive when Jack stepped out of the jet bridge, but to him it all felt strangely distant, like a world moving behind glass. Morning light poured through the huge terminal windows and spread across the polished floor in pale bands, catching the wheels of his suitcase as they rolled softly behind him. People crossed in every direction, families reuniting, business travelers checking phones, children dragging backpacks far too big for their shoulders. Announcements echoed overhead in a calm, practiced voice. Somewhere nearby, a coffee machine hissed. Everything was exactly as an airport should be, and yet Jack felt none of it in the ordinary way. His body was tired from the long flight, from hours folded into a seat, from sleeping only in fragments, from the dull ache that always followed too many time zones. But that wasn't what was pushing his heart faster. It was the thought that she was here, somewhere just beyond the sliding stream of strangers, beyond the terminal signs, beyond the crowd, waiting. He tightened his grip on the suitcase handle and walked faster. He had imagined this moment more times than he cared to admit. On long nights overseas, when the branch's problems felt endless and his mind had gone too tired to think clearly, he would close his eyes and picture only one thing: Tu Tien waiting for him. Her face, her voice, the way her eyes softened when she saw him after even one ordinary workday apart. That image had carried him through weeks of exhaustion better than sleep ever did. Then he saw her. She stood near the barrier in a thin coat, hands clasped lightly in front of her, eyes searching the crowd with a kind of quiet desperation she was trying very hard to hide. She looked slimmer than he remembered, maybe not truly, maybe only in the way longing changes the eyes of the person who returns. There was worry in her face, and hope, and the kind of tenderness that makes distance feel suddenly cruel. The moment their eyes met, everything else disappeared. The voices, the announcements, the movement around them, it all dimmed. Jack let go of the suitcase handle without even realizing it. It tipped slightly to one side and rolled only a few inches before stopping. He was already moving. He walked quickly at first, then faster. Then he was no longer walking at all. Tu Tien saw it and started toward him too, her expression breaking open into a smile so full of relief it almost looked painful. He reached her in seconds, and when they collided into each other, the force of it was not graceful or careful. It was desperate, honest. Months of restraint breaking all at once. Jack wrapped his arms around her so tightly it felt like his whole body had been waiting to remember her shape. Tu Tien clung to him just as fiercely, her fingers gripping the back of his coat as if distance were a physical enemy she could keep from taking him again by holding hard enough. He lowered his face into her hair and breathed her in. There it was, her familiar scent. Soap, fabric, something floral and faintly sweet, something entirely hers. It hit him with such force that for 1 second he had to close his eyes against the sting rising behind them. He had forgotten what it was like to breathe without absence in it. Tu Tien pressed her cheek against his chest and listened to his heartbeat. Strong, fast, real. Not a voice on a screen, not a late night call cut short by meetings, not a face frozen in weak connection. He was here, warm, solid, breathing, home. Neither of them spoke right away. They didn't need to. The embrace said everything words would only slow down: how long the waiting had been, how sharp the loneliness, how many nights had ended with quiet promises into phone screens, how much of themselves had remained stretched across distance without breaking. Airport staff passed around them, suitcases rolled by, someone laughed too loudly near the coffee kiosk. The world continued. They stayed still in the middle of it. At last, Jack drew back just enough to look at her. His hands stayed on her arms. Tu Tien, he whispered. His voice broke slightly on her name. That was enough to undo her. She laughed softly through tears she hadn't meant to let fall and shook her head as if even now she still couldn't believe he was in front of her. "You're really here," she said. Jack smiled, but it was the kind of smile that comes with too much feeling beneath it. "I'm here." He kissed her forehead first, then held her again for one more second before reaching back for the suitcase. She took his free hand at once, without asking, without thinking. Their fingers fit together with the ease of something that had never forgotten. The drive away from the airport felt quieter than either of them expected. Sunlight flashed through the windshield in shifting patterns as the city slipped around them. Overpasses, traffic lights, buses, rows of early commuters with tired faces and takeaway coffee. Jack drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting under hers on the gear shift. Tu Tien had turned toward him in her seat and kept looking at him as if any long blink might return him to a screen instead of a driver's seat beside her. He noticed it after a while and smiled. "What?" he asked. She shook her head. "Nothing. That's not true." A small smile touched her mouth. I got used to missing you. I think my heart hasn't caught up yet." That sentence settled between them with more tenderness than any dramatic declaration could have carried. Jack squeezed her hand. He told her about the trip, but only in pieces. Long meetings. Too many delays. Problems that multiplied when people tried to hide them instead of fixing them. He didn't want to bring the whole weight of the overseas branch into the car with him. Not today, not now. He only wanted her to understand enough to know why he had looked so tired in some of those calls. Tu Tien listened carefully, the way she always did, not interrupting, not competing with his exhaustion, just receiving it. "You look thinner," she said quietly. Jack laughed. "That bad?" That worried. He glanced at her, and for a second the light caught the side of her face just right, soft, familiar, achingly loved. "I'm better now," he said. It was true. Not because the work was solved. Some of it still followed him like a shadow, but the worst of the tension had started to lift the moment he saw her waiting in the terminal. There are problems the body carries differently once love is in the same room again. The city thinned gradually around them. Buildings gave way to greener streets, quieter intersections, longer shadows from roadside trees. The closer they got to home, the less either of them felt the need to talk. Their silence changed shape. At the airport, it had been overwhelmed. In the car, it became intimate, sacred, almost. The kind of silence built not from discomfort but from recognition. Her hand in his thumb brushing over her knuckles every now and then. Her gaze drifting from his face to the road and back again. The low hum of the engine. The familiar route unfolding around them like a promise being kept. She remembered the months without him in flashes. The empty side of the bed, the mornings when no coffee waited, the evenings when she still turned instinctively toward the door at a certain hour even though she knew no footsteps would come. Waiting had changed the shape of time. Some days had dragged. Others had disappeared without mercy. Only his calls had held the line between them steady. "You really called every day," she said after a while. Jack looked surprised. "I said I would." "I know." She smiled faintly and looked down at their hands. "I just think people promise things when they're leaving. Not everyone keeps those promises." Jack's grip tightened. "I'm not everyone." "No," she said softly, "you're not." By the time they turned into their familiar neighborhood, both of them were breathing differently. Anticipation had returned, but not the anxious kind. This was something deeper. The house ahead held more than shelter. It held the quiet life that had been paused by distance and was now about to start breathing again. Jack parked. Neither of them moved right away. The house stood there in the late morning light, ordinary and beloved. The same gate, the same small path, the same doorway that had watched one goodbye and was now waiting for something much kinder. Tu Tien was the one who opened her door first. Jack came around the car, but when he reached the front step, she was already there, closer than he expected, looking up at him with that same unbearable mixture of relief and longing that had nearly broken him in the terminal. They stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind them, and the world outside disappeared. The sound of the door closing was soft, but it changed everything. 1 second they were stepping out of sunlight and into the narrow hallway. The next, the outside world was gone, the airport, the roads, the months apart, the schedules, the branch overseas, all of it cut away by one simple click. Only the two of them remained in the hush of the house, standing close enough to feel each other's breathing. Jack set the suitcase down without looking at it. Tu Tien stood just a few inches away, her coat still on, one hand loosely at her side, the other clutching the strap of her bag as if she had forgotten she was holding it. She had imagined this moment too many times during the months he was gone, but imagination had never managed to capture what it would feel like to have him right here in front of her, within reach, not leaving, not fading into distance again. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. They looked at each other with the kind of intensity that only comes after too much waiting. Her eyes held every lonely night, every late call, every message that ended too soon because one of them had to sleep or work or pretend to be strong for one more day. His gaze carried the same thing back distance: exhaustion, longing, and the ache of finally being allowed to stop pretending this separation had not hurt. Then Jack lifted one hand and touched her face. His fingers were warm, slightly rough, trembling more than he wanted them to. He brushed one thumb along her cheek as if confirming reality. Tu Tien closed her eyes for one heartbeat at the touch, and when she opened them again, her lips had parted slightly without her realizing it. The first kiss came fast. Not planned, not gentle, not careful. It was fierce with relief. Jack leaned down and kissed her like a man trying to cross the last impossible distance between them all at once. Tu Tien rose into him instantly, one hand flying to the back of his neck, the other gripping his shirt. There was nothing hesitant in it. Months of patience broke open in a second. The kiss deepened almost before it began, hungry and aching and full of all the words they had not been able to say over screens and bad connections and time zones that had stolen the easiest hours of their lives. Jack's hand moved to her waist and pulled her closer until there was no space left between them. Tu Tien pressed herself into him just as fiercely, terrified on some irrational level that if she loosened her hold, even for a second, he would disappear again into airports and flights and distant office lights. The kiss slowed, then flared, then slowed again. Their breaths grew uneven. Jack tasted salt and realized tears were already slipping down her cheeks. He kissed them away without thinking, his thumb brushing the dampness from her skin only for more to appear. These weren't the tears of sorrow he had feared hearing in her voice during the weeks apart. These were something more overwhelming, joy returning too suddenly for the body to contain neatly. When they finally broke apart, it was only by a few inches. Their foreheads rested together. Their eyes stayed closed. They breathed in the same air and held on to each other as though both of them needed proof that this was not another dream cut short by a ringing phone. "I'm home," Jack whispered. His voice was hoarse. The words sounded small compared to everything they meant. But Tu Tien smiled through tears anyway. "I know," she whispered back. She was still holding his shirt in both hands. He was still touching her like letting go would be a mistake. For one suspended moment, the hallway itself seemed to vanish. There was only warmth, breath, heartbeat, and the silent certainty that whatever distance had tried to do to them, it had failed. Eventually, Tu Tien laughed softly, embarrassed by her own tears. "You haven't even taken your shoes off," she said. Jack gave a quiet huff of amusement. "I was a little distracted." That made her laugh again, more fully this time, and the sound of it did something to him. It took the last sharp edge off the tension he had been carrying since before the flight. He kissed her forehead one more time, then bent to kick off his shoes and move the suitcase properly inside. The house looked exactly the same as when he left. That was what struck him first. The table by the window, the lamp on the side shelf, the book he had abandoned before the airport run, now neatly stacked, the jacket still hanging where she had left it. Nothing grand had changed. But now that he was back inside, everything felt restored in some invisible way, as if the walls themselves had been holding a breath they could finally release. By late afternoon, the mood inside the house had softened from reunion shock into something quieter and more domestic. Tu Tien moved into the kitchen with the kind of concentration she always carried when she wanted to turn feeling into care. She slipped off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and stood for a second before the counter, thinking through the meal she had planned. Today wasn't just dinner. It was welcome, relief, celebration, repair. A fresh chicken waited on the counter. She rinsed it carefully, then rubbed it with salt, pepper, garlic, and herbs, working the seasoning into the skin with both hands, almost tenderly. The scent rose at once: sharp rosemary, crushed garlic, fresh fat, clean raw meat ready to become something warm and golden. She preheated the oven and slid the tray inside, then stood watching through the glass for a moment longer than necessary. She remembered the evenings when he was gone. Cooking alone had never felt tragic exactly, but it had always felt incomplete. Food lost something when there was no one across the table to smile, to eat slowly, to say this is good in a voice that made her believe it mattered. Now he was only in the next room, and somehow even the chicken roasting in the oven seemed to know the difference. She began a small pot of sauce, stirring absent-mindedly while humming under her breath. It was an old tune, one Jack always noticed whenever she sang it, because it only appeared when she was truly content. He heard it before he entered the kitchen. Jack pushed the door open quietly and stopped just inside. For a second, he only watched. Tu Tien stood with her back to him in the warm light, stirring the sauce, her hair falling loosely over one shoulder. The oven glowed. The room smelled of herbs, heat, and home. That single image hit him harder than anything in the airport had. This her in the kitchen, evening gathering outside, a meal being prepared because he was back was what he had actually missed. Not just her face, the life made around it. He stepped forward and set a brown paper package on the table. Tu Tien turned immediately. Her eyes lit up the moment she saw him, and he felt a ridiculous rush of pride at what he was carrying. "What's that?" she asked. Jack opened the paper and lifted the lid of the box inside. A rich, creamy scent bloomed into the kitchen. "Specialty cheese," he said. "I brought it back." Tu Tien leaned in, inhaled, and smiled in real delight. "You carried cheese across countries? I carried more than that." She laughed. Soon they were standing shoulder to shoulder at the counter, talking through what to do with it. Melt some over the chicken, add some to the seafood, try it while it's still fresh. Their hands brushed as they cut it, and each time the touch landed with a sweetness that no longer startled either of them. Instead, it grounded them further into the shared rhythm they had both been missing. As the cheese softened in the oven and the smell spread richer through the room, it felt like a perfect metaphor. Neither of them bothered to say aloud. Warm, stretching, clinging, closer the nearer it came to heat. Dinner glowed on the table under the lamp, seafood steaming. Roasted chicken shining under melted cheese that stretched in thin white threads every time the knife moved through it. They sat facing each other and ate slowly, not from politeness, but because neither wanted the moment to pass too quickly. Then it happened. Jack cut into the chicken and lifted his fork, and a delicate strand of cheese stretched up with it, absurdly long and trembling in the air. Both of them stared for one beat, then burst out laughing at the exact same second. Tu Tien reached toward it and tugged gently, making it stretch even farther. Jack joined in, and suddenly they were playing with it like children, pulling it longer, seeing how far it would go before it snapped. Every break sent them into another round of laughter. Every new strand became another excuse to touch hands, to lean closer, to keep the joy moving through the room. Underneath the laughter was something deeper. Release, the weight of all those separated months, all those missed dinners and incomplete evenings, was finally loosening. The meal was delicious, yes, but more than that, it was shared. That was what mattered. Shared food, shared laughter, shared time finally no longer interrupted by a screen. By the time the plates were nearly empty and the final long strand of cheese had fallen back onto the plate in surrender, the night outside had deepened completely. Stars had begun to appear. The air beyond the porch looked cool and dark and inviting. Jack reached across the table and took her hand. "You know," he said softly, "I dreamed of this moment the whole time." Tu Tien looked at him, her thumb moving slowly over his knuckles. "Me too," she said. Later, they stepped out onto the porch and sat side by side on the steps beneath a sky washed with stars. The air was cool against the warmth left from dinner. Jack wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back into him, letting the weight of herself rest fully there. No hurry, no fear now. Just the night, their breathing, the faint smell of grass and cooling earth, and the quiet knowledge that some loves really do survive distance by refusing to become less themselves. After a long silence, Tu Tien whispered, "Don't go far again, okay?" Jack answered not with words first, but by holding her tighter. Then, very softly into her hair, "I'll always come back." After months of separation, Jack finally returns home from an exhausting overseas assignment, and the reunion begins the instant he sees Tu Tien waiting for him at the airport. What starts as a desperate embrace quickly becomes something deeper, a release of all the loneliness, longing, and strength they were forced to carry while apart. On the drive home, they barely need words. Their silence is filled with relief, love, and the simple miracle of being close again. Once inside the house, the first kiss they share is intense, emotional, and overwhelming, as if they are trying to reclaim every lost second. Later, as Tu Tien prepares a special dinner and Jack surprises her with imported cheese from his trip, their reunion softens into laughter, warmth, and domestic peace. At the table, they laugh like they never lost time, and under the night sky, wrapped in each other's arms, Jack makes the only promise she truly needs to hear. No matter how far he goes, he will always find his way back home.